Hello everyone, it's Shrimpin' time. So I'm gonna play this clip in this map, and I'm gonna see what you guys have to, think about this clip. And we're just gonna kind of look at this mapper and, you know, think about what maybe their big problems are. Okay, so you saw that key eye there, and if your answer was that the rhythm sucks or their movement sucks or whatever it is, I think all those things have some truth to it. But what stood out to me the most was how cluttered it was. The placements of objects convoluted the relationships between them, and it no longer was representing the song with how the objects were actually patterned together and grouped together. And so we're going to be talking about really how that happens and all the we're going to break it down effectively, right? So I would say that clutter is an important concept to understand because it increases your cognitive workload when you're playing or viewing the map. It is not something that's inherently bad to have clutter, but what it does is it messily relates objects that may or may not be intended to be related. In this case, you had many of these phrases that were grouped together in sort of the same place, and it was difficult to sort of tell where one phrase began and the other ended, right? So we want to avoid that in a map, ideally, most of the time. And there's some cases where it may be, and just in everything in OSU, there's exceptions to every rule. So to really understand this, I think we need to talk about Gestalt principles, which are really sort of a theory about how humans create relationships between things. And I think Gestalt philosophy is really based around this idea of holism, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? Individually, yeah, this is an object, but that doesn't really do very much by itself. It's not until you put it into like a square, where now the square is greater than the sum of those four individual objects that composed that square, for example, right? And, we think about the song. The song has the same idea. You have all these different instruments that are composed, that are part of that song, but it's not until you put them all together that you get a song, right? That you get something really enjoyable and meaningful. So we don't really see individual objects, I think, when we're playing OSU maps, when we're viewing OSU maps. It's not really until you start mapping that you're slowing things down so much that you start looking at objects as individual things. And it takes practice and application to be able to then sort of back up and see it from that holistic picture that the player or the viewer would be seeing it as. So this is kind of like a natural roadblock that all new mappers have to experience. But the core idea is that this slider here doesn't exist in isolation. It exists with all the objects around it. And a really important sort of idea is this idea of the common region, which, when we're talking about things in an enclosed space, things in that same space are assumed to be related, right? So really everything on this playfield, it could be seen as an enclosed space, but realistically, if I put something on this corner and something on this corner, that's not really going to be assumed to be related. But when I put this here, this here, this here, this here, well, now they're all kind of in this same region, and then there's that relationship being formed intentionally or not as a result of that. And this is kind of along the same idea, but it's a slightly different idea, but it's something to consider. And it can be a really powerful tool, but you have to know it exists and be looking out for it, because I've seen many, many mappers make mistakes where they're inadvertently relating objects that they didn't want to. And if you accidentally create these regions, you start grouping things that in a way that weren't meant to be grouped. And that's a big part of where clutter comes from. So we're going to compare a couple different maps here. So we're going to compare let me pull it up here. Lover Girl from the mapper Mirror. And we're going to look at this one. This one I would consider to be a sort of conventionally pleasing to look at map, a conventionally good aesthetics. And a big part of the aesthetics in this map is that it's not cluttered at any point. The relationships between objects are very clear. It makes use of all the Gestalt principles that we're used to, symmetry and all that fun stuff. But at no point does it ever feel cluttered. At no point do objects feel related that shouldn't be. So that's kind of what I would look at as the conventional sort of norm, I guess. Another one that I want to look at is this Wing My Way difficulty, guess difficulty by Fuxi. Where is it? There it is. And in particular, I wanted to look at a specific pattern. So overall, you know, you have this stuff, and I still think that this map is fairly conventionally decent to look at. It's not ugly by any means. But let's take a look at what happens over here. Starting like right here. See what happens. Did it kind of get a little bit sort of cluttered, a little messy? Because I think it kind of did. And what I look for is, if I do this, should kind of be a little bit more clear as to maybe why I think that. You end up having two different phrases here. You have this build-up phrase, and then you have this phrase here, where the instrumental changes a little bit, and the vocal fades out. Sort of ending up being in the same place, and oftentimes overlapping in unintentional and messy ways. And, you know, that by itself, okay, maybe not the end of the world. But, you know, let's look over here. You have another phrase here, particularly right here where the phrase changes. And it stays in the same place on the playfield, same spacing and all that, right? So it ends up kind of getting pretty cluttered in several of these patterns. And this is an example of what I would consider to be sort of ineffective use of using the playfield, using these ideas, this Gestalt principle idea, to that's inadvertently relating patterns and phrases in the music to each other that shouldn't be related necessarily. So those kinds of are some examples that I wanted to mention. And again, those are both on conventionally attractive looking maps. So what I want to be really clear on is that cluttering is not an inherently bad thing, right? Like, I really, really want to be clear on that. Because really all the ideas of Gestalt are about building patterns and relationships between things that our human mind then can correlate. And again, objects by themselves don't exist. They don't form relationships until you start pulling in things like symmetry and, you know, focal points and such, right? A big thing that I think is causing these patterns to be related in a messy way is that they have a very similar focal point. And this is a common trend I see in especially newer mappers. You know, if I go back to the original map that I pulled up from Berna, and this is, again, this guy's first map, so don't there's nothing wrong with this by any means. I have a similar issue for sure. But the big reason that these objects are cluttered is that they share the very same focal point, or at least a very similar focal point. And what I would describe, and the focal point, by the way, can be sort of described as the center of interest or activity. And so when you're looking at a grouping, say, of like a star here, the focal point is going to be the center of the activity, right? Which is right here. And this is how most people will be relating these objects. They will view this focal point as that center of activity. And anything that has that same focal point is inherently going to be related. So we can look at this pattern. Okay, we have this focal point. What's the next pattern, right? Oh, so the next pattern, the focal point for this next pattern is right here. So it moved very slightly, but it's in effectively the same place. And as a result, this pattern here ends up feeling very similar and very, I guess, close to this previous pattern in a way that is not necessarily intended, right? And then we look at the next pattern. Oh, so we have sort of this going on. So the focal point's somewhere like right here. And so as you can see, we haven't moved very much in this extended period of time in this map. And as a result, that leads to this feeling of being cluttered. And so again, I really want to emphasize that you can have a very cluttered yet conventionally aesthetic map, such as the Fuchsi difficulty I showed you, which had the same issue that I think that this had, right? If I go back to that Fuchsi difficulty, where we have this pattern, and the focal point's right about here during all of this. And where we go back over here, focal point like right here during all this, still right here, and it's moving slightly, right? But like in all of this, you have this grouping here. Focal point's right about here. Over here, focal point's right about here in this pattern. Focal point right about here. And so it moves around. And that's all right. But like then you have this pattern here where we have two different musical phrases. And it's all fine up until here, right? So like this moves around, focal point right here, and that's grouping. Then it moves over here. But then it just kind of stays like right about here, right in this area. And it ends up grouping all of this entire phrase together. And that may or may not be intentional. But what that leads to, because it's such a long time where we're keeping that same focal point in the same place, it does lead to the sense of clutter. And that's on a conventionally aesthetic map. Whereas when I showed you Mir's difficulty, which was also another conventionally aesthetic map, that focal point moved around freely. So we have here, focal points right here, moving around. Focal points right here in this pattern. Focal points right here. Focal point comes down to here and then up to here. This is that. I want to look at that one. So you have stuff like this. Focal points right here and then moves over here. So it's never staying on one place, right? Focal point right here. Comes down here. Focal point in here in this pattern. So again, it never stays in one place, and as a result, the patterns that are supposed to be separated feel separated. They feel distinct. They don't interact in any kind of contradictory way. So let's take a look at maybe an example of a map that does it on a more messy style. And my examples are going to be from Wafer, who I think most people would consider to have a fairly messier aesthetic. But this is a map a recent map of his actually, that I think is fairly messy, but it's not cluttered. And why I don't think it's cluttered is because if you look at the focal points in all these patterns, they move around and they use that focal point to represent changes in the song, right? So by keeping the focal point in one place on the playfield with that pattern, you're grouping all the objects in that pattern together. And when the pattern or when the phrase in the song changes, that focal point is then moved to a different place on the playfield. So you have here focal points. So focal point in this pattern is like right here, and then it moves to here, and then it moves to up here. Focal point very much so right here. And they use like these longer sliders to transition from focal points like over here to over here. Focal point pretty much in here in this pattern, but it doesn't stay there very long, right? As soon as the song suggests a change, right? You have a change in the song, it moves out. Some cases they do stuff like this, right? Where they do keep that focal point in one place, but it's done to capture sort of the overall song there, right? That phrase it captures by keeping it together. Same thing here, right? By keeping that focal point, connecting these two objects, you have that. But notice that they don't have their next pattern after this right here. It's down here. It's in a different place on the playfield so that the objects don't then somehow become related. Now, if we, say, moved it over here, now it ends up relating these phrases, which may or may not work, but it's clearly not what they're intending because they separated it. So that's a conventionally messy style that doesn't feel cluttered. Now let's take a look at a conventionally messy style in this difficulty, in this map, also from Wafer, that does sort of have that cluttered aesthetic, the cluttered feeling. And I apologize for the song. It's not very good. So they do a lot of this stuff, right? A lot of this cluttering of these objects. And what they're doing is they're taking, even though it's really, really messy and relatively cluttered, they're taking this whole phrase of this song and they're grouping it all together by keeping it all in one focal point. Right here as well. There, over here. And what's nice is that you can get a really cool feeling, like in this section here. The focal point doesn't stay in one place very long. It kind of moves around a little bit more openly, and it really makes the section feel different as a result. Compared to the awkwardness, the uncomfortability in these sections over here, where by keeping that focal point in the sort of the center of this like tightly packed pattern, you really create the sense of discomfort and clutter. All right, so I do want to also look at a difficulty that I think uses focal points in a way that follows the overall song really effectively. So let's take a look at this one. And this is going to be from Mirage on Kigurumi Sungeki. This map is like super, super fun. But the nice thing is that I think it has a very approachable style, a very fun, approachable style, but it uses patterns to build into bigger wholes, right? It really takes that Gestalt principle of the common region and it puts it to the test. So you end up with a lot of really intentional groupings, a really intentional use of focal points to relate ever-growing patterns, right? These patterns that build on each other because they use the same focal point. And this is a really effective use of that. So, for example, you have this pentagon that's being created here. Well, that focal point for this pattern is right here. So how can you build on this to show this sort of crescendo, this build up in the song? Well, you can create a bigger pattern or a pattern around this pattern that uses the same focal point. So let's take a look here. We have a square or a diamond, however you want to call it, but it has the same focal point right in the center of that pentagon, right? And so as a result, this build-up phrase, despite them having different movements, different intensities, different spacings, it feels like they're related to each other. So here, for example, this triangle, focal point right here, putting the slider in between that then relates this the slider to the triangle. And certainly that's a small example, so let's see if we can find a better example that does it in a bigger way. So triangle, focal point like right about here, focal point right about here, so about the same. And then focal points just slightly moving around, but what it's doing is it's really creating this sense of continuity, right? All these circles then create a bigger whole, which I think does a really effective job at grouping the sounds in the song in a way that's representative of the song itself. And then it breaks away over here, and now the new focal point's over here. So this focal point here, focal point here, focal point here, it's moving, and then the section breaks, there's a new pattern that's being formed here, and it's very clearly a new pattern because the focal point for this new pattern is like right about here, right? So it's in a pretty different spot now. Sometimes they use focal points sort of more isolated. Like in this case, this triangle's focal point is right here. This one's over here. This one's here. And so it really creates the sense of three different groupings that clearly are very indicative of how Marash was interpreting what the song was doing here. Or for example here, where you have this grouping right here, this focal point right here, is a bigger square around it. Even though it's a wide angle instead of a sharp angle, it's going to feel like it's part of the same pattern, effectively, right? Because it's that same focal point. This is a really good example where that's overlapped, right? So it's overlapped, so it's very clear what's going on. And this one actually builds up even more, right? So you have this triangle, focal point right here, focal point. And then this one right here, the focal point's basically the same spot, maybe slightly up here. And they put this next triangle in the focal point area. This one's a little bit more of a complex focal point pattern, but it's right here, where they built up to creating that opening for it. This one's definitely going to be building up. So this one's like in the song, this is a build up for the sort of the drop, if you will. And so you have this pattern that is using symmetry to create this focal point right in the center of the screen, which then Marash pays off by putting sort of the big emphasis object right there in that focal point. So it was building up to that payoff for several seconds. So a really, really powerful emphasis on here as a result of using this focal point idea. Now, to be clear, most rappers don't think about this necessarily consciously. A lot of it is subconscious. A lot of it is habitual. But for newer mappers, you don't have that sense yet. And so this is something to think about consciously. And I think it really helped me and improve my own mapping when I thought about this myself. And this is something that I learned certainly from like my mentors, Mir, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure that you all are wondering at this point, what the hell is up with the Subway Surfers, right? And this was my silly little experiment. I want you to ask yourself, when that came up on the screen, did you feel like it was becoming a little cluttered? And probably the answer is, yeah, it probably did become a little visually cluttered on the screen. While the stuff on the center was going on, you had the stuff on the side of the screen kind of distracting you. Yeah, there's just more visual stuff. What's more confusing, that or this? Okay. So hopefully that maybe helps it make a little more sense as to like how clutter happens. If you are conscious about the focal points of your patterns and moving those focal points around as the patterns change, right? So you have one pattern, has one focal point, and you have a separate musical idea. Well, make your next pattern have a different focal point on a different part of the screen. And that will really help to avoid the sense of clutter. And if you want to create relationships between objects, between patterns, you keep a similar focal point, and then it actually will build that relationship that you're looking for in a more sort of meaningful way. As you can see, of course, by this Mirage map, which moves the focal point around and keeps it in the same place, kind of according to whether it's trying to build a bigger pattern, build a bigger musical phrase, or separate musical phrases, which is really, really effective. So clutter is not inherently evil, and you can absolutely use it for emphasis, but without being careful, it can really undermine your representation of the music. Well, hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, let me know. I'm happy to try to explain it in a different way, but yeah, hopefully it is as simple as that.